The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
Today is Thursday, August 25th, 2022. Thank you so much for joining me. I wanted to give you an update on where we are with the campaign that we launched about 2 weeks ago, going on 3 weeks. The campaign for Coexistence, which we're breaking out into 3 distinct parts. The first part was to address Christian nationalism, which has emerged as a contemporary threat. While Christian nationalism has historically been the religion of white supremacy, and so many groups have had to fight for their freedoms and liberties directly from this group of white Christian men that Bill O'Reilly of Fox News identified as the power structure in this country. While that has been historically true, we are currently living in a renaissance, a resurgence of Christian nationalism, and we are living in an era where we're dealing with nationalists who intend on using a very narrow interpretation of Christianity to overthrow this democracy. It goes beyond the idea of a particular sect of Christians wanting to champion their faith. We're dealing with a very zealotous sect of Christianity that wants to dominate society and create laws based on their specific interpretation, which is as dangerous to black Christians as it is to atheists. It is as dangerous to straight people as it is to gay people, the LGBTQ community. It is all around a threat to democracy and, quite frankly, humanity, because the people behind this Christian nationalist push are fascist. I've outlined that in the paper that I wrote, The Cruel and Impotent God of Christian Nationalism, which began this entire campaign. And I also have launched a video that has gone somewhat viral. We are approaching 2 million views across the different platforms. It was shared on Instagram by comedian D.L. Hughley, and overnight it's already at 560,000 views just on his page. On my Instagram page, it is currently at 500,000 views, or over 500,000 views. And on our YouTube page, it also has over 500,000 views. And it's been going viral on TikTok as well as, somewhat on Twitter. But I want to play that clip for you because that represents the second stage of this campaign. It is critical for people of good faith, and I mean that in the broadest sense possible, not just Christians, but it's important for people of good faith to unite around opposing this threat to coexistence that is Christian nationalism. And this was the first move. I want you to listen to this clip and then we'll discuss it. When black pastors are going viral for stuff like this,
you name it, Gucci, Louis, you name it.
Or this.
Beyonce just released Church Girl.
Or even worse, this.
And y'all know I asked for one last year. Here it is the whole way in August. I still ain't got it.
Meanwhile, Christian nationalist pastors are preaching sermons of hate like this.
You cannot be a Christian and vote Democrat in this nation. I don't care how mad that makes you. You get pissed off as you want to.
They're calling for violence.
Every single homosexual in our country, they should be sentenced with death. They should be lined up against the wall and shot in the back of the head.
And don't think for a second that just because you're a Christian that nationalism is not going to come after you.
I am sick and tired of allowing black people to get away with calling themselves Christians, and they're just black.
Christian nationalism is the religion of white supremacy. They have colonized Christ, they've gentrified Jesus, and now they're trying to tell us that what we need to do is to be a country that worships the God of Marjorie Taylor Greene.
We should be Christian nationalists.
Or Donald Trump, who doesn't even know what 2 Corinthians is.
2 Corinthians, right? 2 Corinthians 3:17.
White supremacy doesn't care if you're preaching about money.
I'm not worth your McDonald's money. I'm not worth your Red Lobster money.
Christian nationalism is not threatened by the prosperity gospel.
Who wants social justice and reparations and all this? He calling himself a Christian. I'm sick of it.
They're not afraid of preaching politics in their pulpit.
God in the court of heaven today, the President of the United States is Donald J. Trump.
They're not afraid of preaching the gospel of hate.
And if you cannot renounce critical race theory, you are a racist.
Meanwhile, we're preoccupied with how big our wardrobe is, how many shoes we have in our prayer closet, how many watches we get, and how often somebody is twerking to Beyonce.
Sacrilege.
Bishop, with all due respect, nobody's going to hell for twerking listening to Beyonce. But Christian nationalists are sending this country to hell as fast as they possibly can. If your pastor is out here speaking truth to power and fighting for human rights, then I salute them. Put their name in the comment section. We need more of them. And we need those videos to go viral. Share those videos. Because if the only type of Jesus the world sees is the type that serves Christian nationalism or the type that serves Marjorie Taylor Greene or Donald Trump, is there any wonder why people are turning away from the cross? So again, that video has done spectacularly, better than I could have expected. We are probably getting close to 2 million views if I added it up across all the different platforms. And the reason the numbers matter is because the conversation needs to be had. Specifically, where is the black church in response to Christian nationalism? I put this in the category of the conversation we always have had about the need for moderate religious people or progressive religious people to address the zealotous ideology of fundamentalists like Christian nationalists. Christian nationalism is as much a threat to Christians as ISIS is to Muslims. Because if we give them the opportunity to obtain power the way they want, they have made it clear that they intend on using violence against everyone who does not believe specifically what they believe. And that is a danger to me, to my family. And as you all know, I'm as religious as most of you can tolerate. I just dropped that in there for the atheists in my audience and the agnostics, in which I appreciate, because we have a community that represents the type of diversity that is necessary for this country and for this planet to continue. We are on the verge of destruction. And part of the reason is because the white male Christian power structure in this country, as identified by Bill O'Reilly, has used religion, bigotry, fear, and violence to maintain a grip on the very worst policies for this planet. We're talking about a system, not to go too much on a tangent, but it is critical for us to oppose this system as it is right now, because it is a system that has embraced greed as a virtue, hatred as a organizing tool, and bigotry as their baseline. And so if it is being done in the name of Christ, then it's incumbent upon people like me who believe in Jesus to actually get to the root of it, to get to the bottom of it, and to call them out. And so far, so good. Part 1 is to call out Christian nationalism. Part 2 is to unify all the people of good faith that we can reach. I don't care if it's 500 or 500,000. We must reach enough people of good faith to present an alternative model for the future. Because the model that has the money behind it right now, the model for organizing society that is prevalent amongst the politicians, it is one that is destructive. It is one that is divisive, and it is one that is going to clearly bring society to the brink of destruction, if not over the edge into the abyss. So I wanted to give you an update on where we are and what the plan is, because as I have moved away from day-to-day podcasting and broadcasting, I have kept my eye on the ball. I have kept my eye on what I believe is one of the most critical inflection points in our country's history. And it may probably very well be American-centric or Western-centric to consider the fate of the planet to be intertwined with the fate of this country. I don't believe it's hyperbole to say that America is too big to fail. And if America destroys itself, it brings this planet along with it. And we are currently in an ideological arms race, if you would, with theocratic fascists who are grabbing up power at every level of government, from your local dog catcher all the way to the White House. And their intentions are absolutely clear. They have every intention of overthrowing our democracy and installing a theocracy in the name of a white supremacist Jesus that is not even consistent with the Bible that they read.
Christian nationalism.
One nation under God and one religion under God.
The belief that the United States should be ruled by Christians.
We should be Christian nationalists.
And by a certain narrow interpretation of evangelical Christian values.
Evangelicals remain enthusiastically supportive of President Trump.
Jesus Christ! We invoke your name! Amen!
Amen! Election thief! You cannot be a Christian and vote Democrat in this nation. I don't care how mad that makes you. You get pissed off as you want to.
It's not enough to say we're against trannies. You got to be against women's rights, too.
Every single homosexual in our country, they should be sentenced with death. They should be lined up against the wall and shot in the back of the head.
Reject Christian nationalism. That's the first clip that we put out in this campaign. The Black church has been a critical component throughout American history in fighting for civil rights. Yes, on behalf of the Black community, but truly on behalf of everyone, because there has yet to be a group of people who have not benefited from the gains that Black people have gotten through the civil rights movement. Affirmative action is quite literally more beneficial to white women than it is Black people, but it is indicative of the fact that you cannot do something for Black people in this country and not have the positive ramifications reverberate through the entire economy. It just doesn't happen. And so the Black church has historically played a critical role in progress in this country. And I remember during the time of the 2008 election of Barack Obama, around the controversy of Jeremiah Wright of Chicago, his pastor in Chicago, I remember noticing the distinct difference between the political participation of white evangelical pastors and the hesitation and the full-blown reticence of Black pastors to participate at the same level of political intensity that their white counterparts had. And while Jeremiah Wright was being attacked on every single front, I began organizing and trying to rally pastors to push back against the Fox News narrative that this man, this Black man who was preaching the liberation gospel, who was preaching against American empire, against the violence of the American empire, against the violence of racism in this country. He was speaking truth to power, and yet there was barely any response from the thousands of Black pastors who spoke about the same thing in their pulpits every single week. Why? Because it had become ingrained in the minds of Black pastors that they could not use their pulpits in the same way that white pastors like John Hagee uses it every single Sunday. That was a flashpoint for me. That's when I made the decision to leave the pulpit and get involved directly politically. And that's where I've been for the last however many years this has been. I wrote the book, God is Not a Republican, back in 2011, 2012. So it's been some years. But the point remains. If there are no countervailing forces against Christian nationalism, and when I mean countervailing, I mean organized resistance from within the Christian community against Christian nationalism, then that cabal is in striking distance of being able to overturn this democracy and installing their very specific brand of theocratic fascism. It simply has to be opposed. It must be opposed, and there's no better source for opposition against these fascists like Marjorie Taylor Greene and her entire cabal of idolatrous zealots who are now today complaining because the government forgave some student debt. Congratulations if you had some debt canceled. It is quite literally a tenet of the Bible in the Old Testament as well as New to forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. The day of Jubilee. However, we are dealing with a cabal of fascists who would erase that line out of the collective memory of society. Even if it's written in the Bible, it's one that they will ignore because the only debts that those theocratic fascists won't forgive are their own. But I digress. What I appreciate the most about the community that we have built over these years is that we have allowed ourselves to each be ourselves. To be free, to be who we are, and to believe what we believe or not believe anything at all. And I know some of my friends are tired of me pointing this out, but my biggest supporters since the very beginning were atheists who understood that I was a Christian man doing a political work for the sake of the broader humanity. And that has given us the ability to grow a community of coexistence. And that community is a model. Because the only way that we are going to collectively survive as a species is if we allow one another to be free, to have the freedom of religion as well as the freedom from religion. And to be quite honest, that model is not one that is prevailing. One of the difficult challenges of this campaign is having to deal with those people who feel like the solution to the problem of Christian nationalism is to end religion altogether. Now, notwithstanding what that would require an authoritarian fascistic state of its own, but it's also impossible. Waiting to end religion to solve our problems is almost as bad as people waiting for Jesus to come back to solve all of our problems. We've got work to do in the meantime. And in the meantime, there is a model for us to coexist where we put our focus on progress. And the emphasis of our politics is on coexistence instead of destruction. And I'm making a pretty big gamble here. My gamble is that there are far more people who are interested in simply allowing their neighbor to be as free as they want to be as free to worship or not worship as they are. I am counting on there being more of us, more people of good faith than there are zealots, religious or otherwise, who want to dominate society with their one particular ideology. I have to believe that there are more of us than there are of them. The only problem is that the people of good faith have been so divided because we are so diverse. But if the people of good faith unite, we certainly outnumber the enemies of humanity. I haven't had a chance to talk about international politics in some time simply because of, well, life, as well as the focus of this current campaign. But I want to leave you with a couple of comments about the ongoing war in Ukraine. Now, I have not had a chance to talk with you about this since the live show. So I'm not even sure where you stand on the war in Ukraine, if you have any stance at all. But I've just got to speak my truth. For the last couple of days, what's been trending on Twitter has been, quote unquote, Ukrainian Nazis. And the usage of that trend has been from former colleagues of mine in what we consider to be the anti-war left, at least the social media anti-war left, using that as a justification for the war itself. Now, for those of you who have not been in tune, this is a war that was started by Vladimir Putin. Nobody started this war except for Vladimir Putin. Part of the propaganda campaign that Putin rolled out was to label his efforts in Ukraine as the denazification of Ukraine. In other words, Vladimir Putin asserted that because Nazis existed in Ukraine, that he had a moral responsibility to go into Ukraine and rout out all of the Nazis. Now, for anyone who's never even studied Ukraine, been to Ukraine or watched the news, Ukraine was a democracy that had problems just like America. And to be sure, Ukraine has the existence of Nazis, the presence rather of Nazis in their country, just like America. And before I get to the most obvious point here, I want to just throw this at you. If we allow Vladimir Putin to engage in an international campaign of imperialist aggressions, because this is what it is. This is what it's rooted in. This is what he has said himself. He is reclaiming what he believes to be territory that belongs to the fatherland, to Mother Russia. This is language out of his direct mouth. But the justification that is now prevailing on the anti-war left, at least the social media anti-war left, is that because Nazis exist there, this is permission. This gives permission to Vladimir Putin to invade that nation and carry out this now 6-month-long war. We crossed the 6-month threshold this week. I have a problem with that because not only is it illogical, but what happens then if someone invades the United States of America or any other country? Is the presence of Nazis in your nation justification for abandoning a sovereign nation to the ambitions of someone like Vladimir Putin? Because we have plenty of Nazis in the United States of America. We're dealing with a cabal of theocratic fascists who are aligned with literal Nazis, people who espouse the rhetoric and the values of Adolf Hitler, boldly and proudly. Like, we have that entire faction. Neo-Nazis lined up to celebrate Ron DeSantis outside of the CPAC convention that just took place about a month ago. And he has not condemned them because, as Donald Trump said of the Nazis in Charlottesville, there are good people on both sides. So if we allow the presence of Nazis in Ukraine to be the justifiable reason for Vladimir Putin to invade a sovereign nation and kill thousands of people, some of which are his own, then what of any other nation? And another trend that I've seen on the so-called anti-war left has been this. They claim that the route to peace in Ukraine, that the proper route to end the war in Ukraine is for Ukraine to surrender to Vladimir Putin's aggressions. This has been one that has bugged me the entire time. However, I have not had the bandwidth or the time to address it directly. But this week is something different, because we are now 6 months into a campaign in which war has been normalized and justified by the so-called anti-war left here in the United States of America. In 2003, we marched against George W. Bush's push into Iraq. We organized to stop him, and we have consistently called out George W. Bush ever since for the war crimes, for the million Iraqis that are dead as a result of that unjust war. But something has happened to the left here in the United States of America. How utterly disingenuous and disgusting is it to say that the proper action when you are under assault from an ambitious dictator like Vladimir Putin is to surrender? That's cowardice. Not only is it cowardice, but it's complicity. It is the American anti-left doing its part to support the war effort of Vladimir Putin. And of course, I understand the nuances of their arguments. I just think that they're frivolous. To say that you oppose NATO so much that any nation that is even tangentially aligned with NATO, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO, any nation that is tangentially aligned with NATO must be evil. Well, that is a third grade understanding of international politics. And it's one that is rooted in bad faith. It is one that is rooted in neutralizing any opposition to the war march of the imperialist aggressions of Vladimir Putin, who himself is a fascist. It's quite ironic for him to call his campaign in Ukraine the denazification of Ukraine when he is one of the biggest Nazis on the international stage. He is a fascist. He is a part of this global pan-reactionary movement that is trying to reverse the entirety of the 20th century. Vladimir Putin's particular flashpoint would be 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union. That is the benchmark. He is trying to return Russia to the glory days of when he served in the KGB. So I find it entirely disingenuous for people to argue that Vladimir Putin has a right to invade Ukraine because of the presence of Nazis when Vladimir Putin himself is a fascist. When Nazis are not just germane to Ukraine. I covered Nazis marching proudly in Noonan, Georgia a few years ago. The irony. And so when I ask the question, what of the Nazis in America, I have to answer it. The problem is that there is a cabal of American leftists who are so disillusioned about what America is that they are willing to align with anybody to oppose this empire. They are willing to align with the imperialist aggressions of Russia. Not Russia. I want to be specific. Vladimir Putin, because there is a leftist opposition in Russia to what Vladimir Putin is doing. But because of the ridiculousness of Twitter and the power of the algorithm and the effectiveness of American propaganda, one of the most effective tools in this campaign has been to completely neutralize the American anti-war left, where now the American anti-war left, who previously opposed actions like the invasion of Iraq, they are now supportive of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And the insult to injury, the salt in the open wound, is that they have the nerve, people like Tulsi Gabbard, have the nerve to argue that the proper move for peace is for the Ukrainian people to surrender. I've had people throughout the entirety of this invasion point out to me the racism that was captured on film in Ukraine. I'm quite sure there's a lot more racism in that country than that. Anywhere you have whiteness, you're going to find white supremacy, and you're going to find all out racism. But I'm sorry, I'm from the South. Grew up in Mississippi. The very first place I got called the N-word was in South Florida. Please tell me about the racism in that country. And is that a reason to allow it to be invaded and massacres happen because of Vladimir Putin's ambition? No, it's not. It's a disingenuous argument that leads me to believe that the American left has been infiltrated at the highest and the lowest levels. From ye average troll on Twitter to some of the biggest names in independent media, now parroting the talking points of Russia, all the way to an entire political party, the Republican Party, the likes of Donald Trump and Tulsi Gabbard, who was so convincing with her propaganda, she got applauded by Russian state media. And of course, Fox News, who has not found a global despot that they don't align with. It's proper for me to talk about this piece of international politics in context of the conversation about Christian nationalism, because at the core of each of these actions that are taking place across the globe, the invasion of Ukraine, which was ordained by Putin's Archbishop Kyrill, to Viktor Orban in Hungary, aligning with American theocratic fascists. These are all individual parts of a collective global movement to reverse the entirety of all of the progress of the 20th century. Because the progress of the 20th century became a threat to the power holders, no matter what country they were in. The more people organize, the more democracy, the more union efforts, the more rights women have, the more rights every marginalized group has, the more rights you have for the LGBTQIA community represents a direct threat to those whose power is based on religious dogma and political violence. And is that not the very best definition of not only Christian nationalism, but every religious fundamentalist group across the globe? I have a proposition for you. I have not done the paper yet, but I'm going to give it to you now. There is a new global order being organized, whereas the prevailing order right now, which is considered to be neoliberal, not in the economic sense, not in the loosely defined American political sense where we call everybody who isn't progressive, we call them neoliberal. I'm talking about the very specific definition that comes from international relations theory, the academic study of international order. That order is one of quote unquote cooperation. And I put it in quotations because that cooperation comes at the expense of the global South. But that neoliberal order, the underlying principle of it was cooperation around human rights and progress. That neoliberal order is being replaced by a pan-reactionary global order, which says this very simply: cooperation through non-intervention based on human rights. In other words, do whatever you want to do in your nation, so long as you don't get involved in what we do in this nation. So every nation will be free to treat the subjects of their nation however they want without any interference of something like the United Nations, without having to worry about how you treat the minorities in your country or the religious minorities in your nation, or any number of groups who are subjected to the powerful of their nation. It is a full rejection of globalism. And again, we must distinguish between the economic usage of that term as well as the international relations usage of that term. Globalization in the economic sense has been detrimental because we've outsourced all of our jobs. True. But globalization in the sense of internationalizing our concern for human beings wherever they are, that is precisely the type of globalization that they oppose. We are living in an inflection point in human history, not just American history, but global world history, where the most powerful people on the face of the planet have said that they are tired of progress. They are tired of freedoms being extended to people whose lifestyles they disagree with. They are tired of the threat that comes from unionizing. And just as an aside, Ukraine is not a utopia. They just banned the right for unions to organize in their nation. And so they certainly have their problems, but that is not justification to allow Vladimir Putin to invade that nation, because what is the state of unions in Russia? Hell, what is a state of unions here in the United States of America? Starbucks is closing every unionized store they possibly can, and the federal government simply just turns its eye. There are certainly problems with the existing world order. But if you believe for a second that the world to come would be better if it's under the control of someone like Vladimir Putin or the theocratic fascists in this nation, well, then why are you listening to this podcast? See you next time.